Hi, we're going to discuss modern psychology, which was in your first reading. And as the reading starts out, psychology's roots really go back, its origins, predecessors can be traced back hundreds, thousands of years. Humans, going back to the Greek philosophers, have speculated on why people think and behave the way they do. So, psychology can find its roots in philosophy and also physiology, the physical sciences, as that became more of an emergent field due to the scientific revolution. So we see major gains being made in the 1700s, 1800s, and so there were people who were interested in philosophy of the mind and also physiology, and they looked to connect those things. So your book talks about some early philosophers, John Locke, Tom Reed, and how they promoted empiricism. Empiricism is really at the root of scientific inquiry, and it's, in a nutshell, truth. The way to find truth is only by what we can observe and prove through our senses, what's real, what is tangible. We also see Locke, especially Locke, the focal point becomes a human person. But even in Locke, Locke was a political philosopher. We see how he deliberates is really based upon like a mental journey, and explains how knowledge is acquired. A lot of people, the founding fathers were heavily influenced by Locke. People like Hobbes, Voltaire, these philosophers are taught in American colleges and universities, and you see the ideas of that being taught in courses on mental philosophy, moral philosophy, and basically the idea that the mind is central in forming our intellect, our free will, and our senses. And your book talks about Hermann von Helmholtz, who was a physiologist, and so he was interested in measuring neural impulses, specifically as it related to hearing and vision. He did extensive experiments, and one of the things that he discovered, which I think all of us can probably relate, is sometimes our senses can deceive us, and they are not really an accurate, they're not accurately portraying what's in the external world. When I drive at night, I see all kinds of things. My eyes fill in gaps, and trees hanging. Your mind a lot of times will fill in blanks. So I'll be like, there's a big baby's head with a pacifier, or I see a dragon. Obviously, I know I'm not seeing those things, but our senses can trick us. Even in hearing, have you ever heard things that maybe you thought you heard somebody say something, but it didn't happen? So, anyways, what we can gain from Helmholtz's work is that there's is that what is psychologically real in our mind may not be completely accurate or aligned with physical reality. And there's also discussion of Ernst Weber and Gustav Fechner. They had a field called psychophysics, which basically introduced ways of measuring human perception related to physical stimuli. There are all sorts of things. If you've ever had a hearing test or eye exam, these are things that really find their roots with Weber and Fechner. Oh, let me move my face up. So, physiological science, physiological, it helps if I can read. Psychological science is born. So we're looking at, so Wilhelm Wundt is considered one of the founders of psychology, and so he set up laboratories to start testing psychological phenomena. He wrote textbooks, he had classes, and trained people in the field of psychology. He was this is where an example of how psychology is born through the emergence of physiology and philosophy. Wilhelm Wundt was that. He was a physiologist, physician, and a philosopher. And so he wanted to understand how the mind works. He taught at the University of Leipzig, which is in Germany. And so he had his students, they would do self-reporting of how they perceive different stimuli. He'd have them go through, if you ever heard of introspection, it's documenting your feelings and things like that. What he wanted to do was understand, we all hear the word consciousness, but he wanted to understand that consciousness is, in essence, how the mind works, the and our awareness of it. Let's see, when people talk about subconscious, it's our mind working when we're not aware of it. So he wanted to look at that. He looked at things like sensation, perception. He looked at how people, their perception of time. And so he really, he's the one who solidified making psychology a science by creating a psychological lab. And so Wundt opened his first lab in Leipzig in 1879. 4 years later, in the US, its first psychology lab opened. So there isn't a delay so much in psychology coming from Western Europe to America in the way it happened with sociology, if you were comparing that. So, psychological, the first school of thought. So, whenever we say schools of thought, those are usually theoretical perspectives. So, there's Tishner, who started the structuralist school of thought. And so for Tishner, he was not concerned at all, and I think your text highlights that. He considered anyone with mental illness, mental deficiencies, what maybe we would call, maybe labeled today as learning disabilities, things like that, children, did not want to look at them. For him, the adult mind, that was what needed to be studied because at that point the human mind was fully developed. And so he was interested. So structuralists are interested in the, you could say structures are parts. They're like parts of the brain. So how, and I apologize, I say brain, I use brain and mind interchangeably, though they, if a neuroscientist was listening to that, would have a heyday. But structuralists were interested in using the scientific method to understand the components of the mind. And you have to think about it, before their time, nobody really had, philosophers weren't talking about, Freud talks about the id, ego, and superego, and these three parts are collaborating yet in conflict with each other, and they make us up, and they have different desires and things like, nobody's talking about that kind of stuff. So structuralists, and Freud was not a structuralist, but they were interested in learning what composed the mind. So if you think about it, 1983, we get the first lab opened in the US, and within 20 years, there are over 40 labs in the US. So psychology really takes off as like a legitimate scientific field in the US and Canada. The American Psychological Association, APA, right? If you're not doing MLA formatting, you're doing APA. That was formed in 1892. Again, these guys are just starting. This is the late 1800s, people introducing this new field of study, and the professional organization forms. So we have Tishner and structuralism. A lot of times structuralism is contrasted with functionalism. And functionalism in psychology is not the same as functionalism in sociology. Functionalism, so structuralism wants to understand components of the mind. What parts are there? Different parts do different things. Where functionalists are interested in the function of the mind, they want to know how the mind operates, what it does. So it's not necessarily that the mind has these different parts that operate differently. They're just focused on solely what is going on here, what mental activities are going on, and how can we define them. Journalism, as your book notes, open the way to animal psychology and comparative psychology. Let's move on. Wilhelm Wundt, as I said before, he wanted to study the, this is actually I think a repeat of it, wanted to study the atoms of the mind. So he's in Germany, starting in the field of psychology, moves to America, and you can see how I'm going to study the atoms of the mind breaks off into these two different fields. One wanting to study the areas of the mind, the other wanting to study the functions. G. Stanley Hall is mentioned in the text. He's the one that founded the first lab in America at Johns Hopkins. We have a timeline here. Hall is influential. He created the first journal of psychology. Oops. He founded the APA, the American Psychological Association. He also mentored Cecil Sumner, who was the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology. I'm going to go, when we talk about, for instance, I'm going to skip, maybe not. We'll later talk about women, pioneering women. So there's another guy, and we're talking, this would be at the turn of the 20th century. So there is evolutionary psychology, which is based, takes a lot of it, of their ideas based upon evolution. Evolutionary psychologists tend to look at human behavior in very animalistic terms. Yeah, I don't know how else to sugarcoat it. There's a video that I might show called The Science of Sex Appeal. So there's a very evolutionary psychological perspective when it's talking about when women are menstruating, their voice deepens. When they come out of that and they're fertile, and that's how they talk, their complexion is better, their voice is higher, and so that makes them more sexually appealing. When they talk about, for instance, sense as in I'm congested, but like that dictating sexual behavior. That's a very evolutionary psychological approach. Charles Darwin's evolution, his cousin Francis Galton bounds on it, and he's Cattle is he follows the idea that things like intelligence are inherited. And so during this time, tests are created. The thing of it is, people like that who go down this track If you've ever studied the history of eugenics or eugenics in America, thought, oh, let's identify superior genes, those with superior intelligence, those that were considered stupid were sterilized so they can have kids. There's a lot of awful things that happen in America with eugenics, and the whole thing was that by not allowing the top to have children, a superior race would form. And then we're talking 1920s and 30s. It's not ridiculous. You see this happening in Nazi Germany, the idea of Superman. And I'm not talking about Clark Kent, but a superior race. This all flows from this field of psychology. This one's kind of out of place, so I'm going to skip and come back. Okay, at the turn of the 20th century, who are some major figures that we have? So we have structuralism, functionalism, but then at the turn of the 20th century, we see this field emerge of behaviorism. So behaviorism is very, in philosophy, it's called positivism, and its truth is only known by what can be observed. And that's empiricism too. What can only be observed through the sense of sight, sound, things like that. We can't understand abstractions like truth or prove God's existence, they would argue, positivism, because we can't see God, things like that. So behaviorism rejects anything where the mind is abstraction. And they, for instance, if you were talking about introspection and feelings and things like that, that's abstract. Behaviorism is focused, as its name implies, on behavior. So they want to understand overt, observable behavior. Why are people doing these things? It was hoped that by learning, using science to study behavior, we could predict and better control behavior. Deter deviance. That's a tongue twister. Deter deviance and create a more ideal society. There were people in sociology that had the same idea. We used science to create ideal people in an ideal society. I don't know if you've ever heard of Pavlov's dog. He was a behaviorist. Pavlov looked at classical conditioning, learning. For instance, he had the dog ring a bell and then feed the dog. So the dog, every time heard the bell, knew that he was going to get fed. Eventually, they would ring the bell but not give the dog food, and the dog would salivate because the dog had been conditioned to expect food. When we talk about conditioning, later we'll talk about learning. Learning is, in essence, conditioning. So, Americans, compared to their European counterparts, they show an interest in psychology, but they want to know what it can do for them. So that kind of psychology is what we would oftentimes call applied psych. So how can I learn to learn better so I can be more successful, things like that. So Alfred Binet, who was French, developed intelligence tests, and the Americans loved it. Henry Goddard brought it in. Louis Terman then standardized intelligence tests, which then became used. They're still being used. And the whole idea with this was if we learn where students are intellectually, we can better identify their needs in school and provide support. But as there's a lot of debate There's the nature versus nurture debate, which is, in summary, I'm sorry, there's so much material and I'm trying to go through it quickly, but nature focuses on things that says we are the way we are because that's how we are biologically constructed. That's how we're chemically composed in the brain. It's through our genes and heredity make us who we are. The nurture side, on the other hand, says we are who we are oftentimes because of how the environments we've been raised, what we've been taught, how we've learned. One of the things that on the classical conditioning is that they did, there was a famous experiment, they showed that fear is learned. So I hate snakes. And there were experiments done where they put little children that had snakes, non-poisonous snakes, but the reaction wasn't fear, so the children didn't mimic or learn fear. And then they had cute little bunny rabbits, and the adults acted like it was the scariest thing in the world, and as a result, the children had a fear of bunnies. Those kinds of things probably wouldn't be kosher with ethics, the ethics that the American Psychological Association has. So there are some experiments that we'll talk about that are things that probably wouldn't fly to. Okay, so applied psych, that was discussed. These are other people that were discussed. Hugo Sternberg was a Harvard faculty member who contributed in industrial psychology. There's fields of psychology today, organizational psychology and industrial psychology. There was also, oh man, I think it was Hawthorne, if you've ever heard of the Hawthorne effect, that did time studies on people, and people in business wanted to use psychologists. Hey, come in and help us figure out how we can make our workers more efficient. Walter Scott, sorry, and Harry Hollingsworth, they did work on the psychology of advertising and marketing, which is a thriving field today. Marketers know how they're using psychological research and data to get you to do what they want, which is to purchase their products. Lillian Gilbreth and her husband Frank, they were, again, industrial organizational psychologists. Lillian did stuff to redesign kitchens to make the space there more efficient. They had 12 kids. If you've ever seen the movie Cheaper by the Dozen, they were the inspiration. And then there's Lightner Whitmer, who's considered the founder of clinical and school psychology. After World War II, as you can imagine, I don't know if we call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Back in those days, they would call it shell shock. And so if you're ever curious, look up shell shock. You can find black and white videos. It's really sad to see that. But there was all kinds of needs for people that were having anxiety, depression, things like that. So the federal government created the National Mental Health Act of 46. It's interesting. So Boulder, Colorado, there was discussion of how do we train people, mental health people. What do we do? The federal government had asked the APA, which was, I think it's the Association of American Academic Psychologists and the American Psychological Association, to come together and find out how basically we could serve the shortage and get people trained in helping people with mental health illness and disorders. So there was in Boulder this conference on graduate education in clinical psychology, and that launched doctoral training in psychology, PhD people. So we hear there was another conference in Vail where they looked at, I apologize, I need to turn off my phone, that's not helpful. The Boulder conference came up with a scientist practitioner model, and the Vail came up with a scholar practitioner. And so that's where it's a SY.D, a doctor of psychology. So some psychologists may have a PhD, which is a doctor of philosophy in psychology. The scholar practitioner model, which is less research based and is really usually those that have PsyD, Doctor of Psychologies, are those that are doing clinical psychological counseling. And the PsyD has become more and more common. Okay. So throughout the 20th century, who were major forces? There's Freud, and a lot of what Freud speculated about the human brain was disregarded. Psychoanalysis was not. And so in psychoanalysis, Freud was a physician who met with disturbed patients, and he kept all kinds of case notes and case studies and developed his theory based upon his interactions with those patients. And basically, you've probably heard people joke about you're the way you are because you were traumatized in childhood, or Freud emphasized the subconscious and unconscious really dictating what we do. And he would, for instance, do hypnosis as a means to try to uncover what the unconscious mind was doing and then try to convince it to do less destructive things. But psychoanalysis it's a way of reflecting on past experiences as a way to understand current behavior. Behaviorism, as I discussed before, really is looking at how we learn behavior. It's focused on observable behavior. If you've ever heard of B.F. Skinner, there's Skinner's box, which was looking at operant conditioning. When we talk about learning, we'll talk about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. But basically, behavior is reinforced through rewards. We have Max Wertheimer, who didn't like Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory psychology. Him and Kurt Koffka, Wolfgang Kohler, Kurt Lewin, who you'll probably hear about more later. They formed, it's called Gestalt psychology. The structuralists focused on, let's study the parts of the mind and how they work. And Gestalt is going the opposite and saying the sum is irrelevant. You need to understand the whole. The whole is more important than the sum, those parts. So they would look at how instead of trying to break down an experience and go through it for hours and up hours, they would instead say, let's look at what was like the feelings, the perception of the whole experience. The thing with them is they say, look, the mind doesn't work in sequence. It's not step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. your mind is, you could be listening to music and reading. It's simultaneously taking in all sorts of information. Most of the Gestalt psychology started in Germany, and this again is by the time of the mid to late 30s. Most of the Gestalt psychologists were Jewish. They fled the Nazis and came to America, and that's how it became popular here, and it's considered a precursor to cognitive psychology. So we'll talk we'll talk more about cognitive psychology in upcoming chapters. In the 1960s, humanistic psychology becomes popular, and instead of focusing on, I don't know, detailing human actions and behaviors and thinking processes, humanistic psychology said, how can we look at the human being, human behavior, understand it, and help people become better? How, how do we help them become, attain their fullest potential? So you may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he said basically human beings have basic needs, and then, so for instance, food and sleep. You're not going to, at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization, and that's like you're in the zone. You're your fullest person. You're achieving as much as you can. For Maslow, he says you can't be at that point if you're hungry at night and don't have a bed. Next level has to do with having relationship and friends. So there's this hierarchy of needs that he identifies, and so in that he would propose and promote, a psychologist's job is to help people move up that hierarchy so they become their fullest potential. Self-actualized is what he called it. Yeah, I don't think the reading, it actually doesn't, I don't know if it gets into this different, we'll talk about. So cognitive, so cognition. Cognition is in essence thinking, how you think, your cognitive abilities. So for instance, if you're drunk, your cognition is impaired, your time is slowed down. If you were given a calculus test, you probably wouldn't do well on it. So cognition, it deals with how we perceive things, how we're thinking, how we communicate, how we solve problems. That's what, I mean, that's cognitive psychology. Cognitive neuroscience is connected to that, but neuroscience is looking at the brain, specifically studying the brain. Neuroscientists, oftentimes, they're doing the MRIs of the brain and seeing what parts of the brain light up on the images and are active. So that's, yeah, that's cognitive psychology and neuroscience. Evolutionary psychology comes in. We see genetics. Genetics becomes, advances as a field in the physical sciences, and psychologists borrow from that. We'll talk more about nature versus nurture. It is very, it's front and center in the social sciences. I'm putting here things that are not necessarily in the reading, but you can look through it. This first, it actually goes into research methods. I will talk about that later and do another video, but for now, that's a good summary of the history, major people, major theories of psychology. Thanks, and have a great week. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.